Welcome to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia, the story of the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles, and the woman behind the myth who never dreamed of infamy. This is Allegra Lansing. In Episode 6, Refuge by the Sea, Elizabeth retreats to San Diego, living quietly, frightened and uncertain, as if sensing that danger has already found her. By the autumn of 1946, Elizabeth Short's life in Los Angeles had slipped into something unsteady and dangerous. What began with promise at Mark Hansen's Carlos Avenue house, warm meals, new clothes, the glow of the Florentine gardens just down the street, had soured into something brittle and controlling. Hansen, the nightclub impresario, was generous only on his own terms. His world ran on power, compliance, and quiet debts, and Elizabeth was not the kind of woman who could be folded neatly into someone else's design. She kept seeing men he disliked, men he believed didn't belong near his home, and in doing so she unsettled the fragile balance he demanded. After a second chance, she crossed an invisible line. Anne Toth, Hansen's confidant and fixer, did what she could. She found Elizabeth a bed at the Chancellor Apartments, a women's hotel filled with dancers, shopgirls, hustlers, and young women living between ambition and survival. But Elizabeth was uneasy there. The building made her nervous. The rumors, the police attention, the way one wrong association could suddenly become a record. By early December, she was scrambling again, her rent unpaid, her suitcases taken as collateral, her future reduced to a few missing dollars and a borrowed coat. On December 8th, Carl Balsiger, a salesman who gave her the money to get the luggage out of hock, drove Elizabeth to the Hollywood bus depot. He believed she was heading north to Berkeley. Instead, she stepped onto a bus bound for the opposite direction, south. It feels like a choice made in a single breath, toward yet another fresh start, toward warmth, toward ocean air that might ease her lungs, toward a city where no one knew her stories yet, where she could arrive as someone new again. Maybe San Diego offered what Los Angeles never quite did, a softer place to land, a quieter corner of the world where she could catch her breath and start over. Or maybe she was running from Balsiger or someone else, and quickly, unexpectedly changed her travel plans and rode the bus into the unknown. There are loose ends here that will never be tied. The jealous Marine in the black sedan that her hairstylist observed, the Yucca Street room that Balsiger claims he rented for her the previous night, the quick change of directions. What remains is the pattern. When things went wrong, Elizabeth moved. She was always moving. Toward relief, away from pressure, through whatever door opened next. At dawn on December 9th, Elizabeth Short arrived in San Diego, into the gray coastal light of a city where she knew no one, where the ocean air was gentler on her lungs, and where she could, for a while, disappear from the most recent ghost that haunted her. The city felt different from Los Angeles in ways that mattered to a woman like her. There was the ocean, yes, but also a slower rhythm, a military town filled with servicemen on shore leave, yet without the relentless edge of Hollywood Boulevard. Men in uniform had always been Elizabeth's comfort zone. San Diego in December was festive. Soldiers crowded the bars and movie theaters, families decorated their homes for Christmas, and downtown buzzed with holiday energy. And yet, Elizabeth made little impression. If anything, she slipped quietly into the background. She had luggage with her, and it could not have been easy to walk the city with 2 suitcases and a hat box, searching for some place warm and dry. But that morning she found a place. The Aztec Theater sat downtown, a modest movie palace with a bright marquee, tiled lobby, and rows of velvet seats, built to draw in both civilians and servicemen in 1946 with the promise of warmth, entertainment, and escape with 24-hour access. By night, its neon glow lit up the sidewalk, and by early morning, it became a quiet refuge where a lone figure like Elizabeth could sit unnoticed beneath the fading light of yesterday's dreams. Around 6 a.m., Dorothy French, a 22-year-old usherette working the overnight shift, noticed the young woman sitting alone. Elizabeth had dozed off in her seat. At first, Dorothy assumed she was dealing with a transient who had slipped inside for warmth. But when she gently woke her, she saw a shy, soft-spoken young woman who looked embarrassed, not hardened or drunk or disorderly, just tired and out of place. Elizabeth told Dorothy she had nowhere to go. She said she wanted to work at the Aztec and asked if they might be hiring temporary help. Dorothy later remembered, "I suggested she talk to the manager the next day. There was something so sorrowful about her. She seemed lost and a stranger to the area, and I felt I wanted to help her. I wasn't sure how. She apparently had no place to stay. I suggested she come home with me and get a night's sleep on our couch, if that would help. She said she was thankful for my generosity." Elizabeth stayed in the theater while Dorothy finished her shift. As the morning progressed, the Aztec's program changed. The Blue Dahlia became the featured film. When it began, Dorothy crossed the aisle to speak with her again. It was then that Elizabeth said she wanted to be known as Betty. Beth had been the persona she wore in Los Angeles. Betty was who she was choosing to be here. When Dorothy French offered Elizabeth Short a place to sleep, it wasn't charity, it was instinct. Something in Betty's quiet, embarrassed presence at the Aztec had made Dorothy pause. She wasn't brash, wasn't hardened in the way so many women passing through San Diego's military nightlife already were. She seemed shy, soft-spoken, careful. Not a troublemaker, not a hustler, just a young woman who looked like she had run out of places to go. So when Dorothy's overnight shift ended, she brought Betty home to the Bayview Terrace Navy housing area, a cluster of modest, identical homes built for hospital workers and military families. These weren't boarding houses or transient hotels. They were government-issued cottages meant for people who worked steady jobs and lived ordinary lives. Nurses, mechanics, clerks, widows raising children on tight budgets. The Frenches were exactly that kind of family. Mother Alvera worked long shifts as a nurse at the Navy hospital. Dorothy helped support the household with her usher's salary. Carrie was a teenage boy growing up in a neighborhood of men who served, bicycles, kids his age, and front porch radios. It was a small, orderly world that ran on routines and responsibility. Alvera, separated from her drunkard husband Gilbert, accepted Dorothy's decision without protest. The Frenches weren't wealthy. There was no spare room set aside for lodgers, no expectation of guests. But there was decency and a willingness to give a girl a chance. That night, Dorothy fixed up the sofa for their guest, with clean sheets and a warm blanket. Betty responded to that kindness in small, careful ways. The next morning she helped with chores, straightened up, tried to make herself useful. She didn't grab her suitcases and leave. She had nowhere else to go. She did not ask to stay there indefinitely, and she had no money to offer them. If she stayed, it would have to be on grace alone. In those first days, she stayed close to the house, quiet, polite, almost fragile. Dorothy would later remember how Betty seemed afraid of the world outside those walls, as if stepping back into the streets might break whatever thin layer of safety she'd just found. When she spoke about herself at all, it was in hints, small fragments of story offered without ever giving away the full truth. She told them she was from Medford, Massachusetts, that she had 4 sisters and a good mother, that she had been engaged to a brave pilot but he had died at the end of the war, that she had done some modeling, Within days, Elizabeth wrote a letter to her mother in Medford, claiming she had found a job at the Navy hospital. It wasn't true. Betty also confided to Dorothy that back in Los Angeles, she had left behind a jealous boyfriend. Whether that threat was real is uncertain. It may have been a story told for sympathy, to make her ride south more dramatic, and her refuge with the French family more necessary than it really was. Time has a way of revealing truths, and within a week or two, the Frenches began to notice cracks in Elizabeth's carefully maintained surface. At first it was small things. The Frenches began to see how Betty's rhythms were not those of a steady young woman. She would spend much of the day indoors, often listless, withdrawn, as if she were hiding. But then she would go out at night, dressed as impeccably as ever. Black suits, white blouses, gloves, her hair carefully arranged, always the flower in her hair. She would vanish into San Diego's downtown for the evening, only to return late, evasive about where she had been and who she had seen. On December 16th, she left the house for the city, telling her hosts that she had an interview at an airline. When she returned, she was driven back in a black coupe. When she came inside, Betty told the Frenches that she had met a man and had gone on a date with him, and he was the one who drove her home. She said nothing further about her job interview, and they were afraid to ask. The man who drove Betty back was a salesman named Robert "Red" Manley. Red, who worked for a plumbing supply company, was in San Diego on a business trip. He was in his car, a 1939 Studebaker, when he saw her at a street corner across from the Western Airlines office. From his car, he tried to pick her up and shouted out, asking if she wanted a ride. She initially turned her head away and refused to look at him, but after he kept talking, she finally turned back and challenged him, asking whether he didn't think it was wrong to ask a girl on a corner to get into his car, at which point he agreed it was, but said he wanted to take her home, and she got in. Red drove Betty back to the Frenches that day, and then went out with her for the next 4 nights, until his scheduled return to the Los Angeles suburbs. Betty never contributed rent to the Frenches, though her presence clearly strained the household's modest budget. She was out late in the evenings, slept well past morning on the couch, forcing Elvira and Carrie to tiptoe around her in their own home. Then on December 22nd, a wire transfer arrived from Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, who still sent her money occasionally. She handed the Frenches $100 from his gift, perhaps to show gratitude, perhaps to ease any tension about her living under their roof. But beyond that, she offered nothing material to sustain her stay beyond tidying up after herself. And thanks to Fickling, she wrote him a letter that was never sent. That letter read, in part, "I do hope you find a nice girl to kiss at midnight on New Year's Eve. It would have been wonderful if we belonged to each other now. I'll never regret coming west to see you. You didn't take me in your arms and keep me there. However, it was nice as long as it lasted." Elvira did not know what to do. She was a working woman, supporting her family, and her grace and hospitality had permitted a freeloader to take advantage of their kindness. She began leaving the classifieds open on the coffee table beside Betty, so that when the house guest woke at noon or whenever, she would see the job ads. But Betty did not search further for work, and the Frenches were growing impatient. It was the holiday season. They decided, however, to give Elizabeth a little more grace before they insisted she move on. On Christmas Eve, Betty had a dinner date with a man named Frank Dominguez. 2 nights later, Red Manley was back in town, and Betty saw him that night. The following night, the 27th, someone honked for Betty outside the French home, and she ran out to join them. She had a second date with Frank Dominguez on New Year's Eve. They went to an El Cajon eatery, where an argument ensued, and Dominguez slapped Betty in the face as witnessed by their bartender. She spent New Year's Day with the Frenches, and the next day the phone calls started. Strange calls, voices Dorothy and Elvira did not know. Betty would hurry to the receiver, answering in tones hushed, sometimes nervous, sometimes animated, never explaining afterward. To the Frenches it must have seemed that she carried a life just beyond their walls, one they could not name but which frightened her. Dorothy remembered Betty as shy, withdrawn, almost hiding. Others who encountered her during this period said she seemed to believe she was being followed. Once she told Dorothy directly that she was afraid of a jealous man. Italian, she said, though it is unclear if this was truth or invention. It fit a pattern. Elizabeth often crafted stories about herself, not always lies, but reshaped versions of her circumstances that gave her more drama, more weight. Yet in San Diego, whether invention or fact, her fear seemed real. What must Dorothy and Elvira have thought watching this girl in their home? A girl who could be so quiet, so polite, folding herself into their domestic life one day, and the next slipping out into shadows, returning with secrets she would not share. They pitied her initially. They grew frustrated at the financial burden they found themselves in. But eventually they began to fear what she might bring to their door. By the end of her stay, Betty was no longer the shy girl found asleep in the Aztec Theater. She was restless, jittery, haunted by something unseen. The Frenches had given her shelter, and in return, they received a glimpse into the contradictions of Elizabeth Short, a young woman who wanted safety but could not sit still, who longed for belonging but never let anyone close enough to anchor her. By early January 1947, the French family had reached their limit. What had begun as an act of kindness, an invitation for one night on their sofa, had stretched into something they could no longer sustain. Elizabeth had been with them for nearly a month, far longer than anyone had expected. Dorothy had welcomed her with open-hearted pity, certain that this pretty, quiet girl needed nothing more than a night's rest in a safe place. Elvira had allowed it because she trusted her daughter's instincts and saw in Elizabeth a fragile creature who reminded her how easily young women could falter when left alone in the world. But the longer Betty stayed, the harder it became to reconcile her presence with the realities of their modest life. Elizabeth contributed no further money beyond the $100 from Fickling a week before Christmas. She did some cleaning, yes, but she wasn't a lodger or a relative. She was a stranger, and a stranger whose life outside their walls was wrapped in secrecy. The strange phone calls continued. Her nightly outings grew longer. The unease in the household sharpened. Dorothy would later recall how Betty seemed afraid, jumpy, as though she expected someone to knock at the door or follow her home. Before long, that fear no longer belonged to Elizabeth alone. It began to hang over the French's home as well. Elvira's frustration turned to anger on January 4th, 1947, when Elizabeth came home with a shopping bag full of cosmetics from a department store. Something would have to be done, the mother told herself. Betty had resumed corresponding with Joseph Gordon Fickling. She told him she was planning to take a bus to Chicago, where she would work as a model for Jack Chernow. She hoped Fickling would join her. He had just left the military and taken work as a pilot back east. The only thing she needed to reach Chicago was $38 for the bus ticket and a ride back to Los Angeles to catch it. Her letters were determined, Chicago or bust, but Fickling did not offer to send more money. On January 7th, Betty was dropped off at the French home early in the day by Salvatore Navarro, another frequent date. That afternoon, 2 men and 1 woman came to the house. They knocked and asked about Betty. Betty refused to see them and became visibly frightened when she learned they were there. That same day, Red Manley wired Betty at the French home, saying he could come by and get her the next day. Early on the 8th, Betty called Carlos Avenue and spoke with Mark Hansen. She likely asked for money. Hansen told her she could stay at the house again only if Anne was also there, and he made it clear he would not send her cash. When he asked why she had gone to San Diego, Betty said a screwball had scared her before she left Los Angeles. Was that screwball Carl Balsinger, the last man known to have seen her before she left L.A.? According to his later statements, he had met Betty 2 days before at a real estate office on the Strip, driven with her to Camarillo, paid for a hotel room, and dropped her off at the Los Angeles bus station the next evening, believing she was headed north to the Bay Area. Instead, without any known prior plan, Betty bought a ticket to San Diego. Did she change direction because she feared Balsinger might follow her? The visit by the two men and the woman at the French home was later confirmed by a neighbor who told Elvira French about it and who passed the information on to police during the investigation. It happened during the day while Dorothy slept after her overnight shift and Elvira was at work. No one answered the door, although Betty was apparently inside. So the three left and drove away. When Dorothy asked Betty about it, she admitted she had heard them knock and peeked at them through a window. She appeared frightened and refused to say more. What the Frenches saw in those final days was not just a guest overstaying her welcome, but a young woman whose life was beginning to feel crowded with things she would not or could not explain. After the knock at the door, the Frenches had come to the end of their patience with their house guest. Finally, the request came. Whether it was spoken gently or with sharper edges, we do not know, but the meaning was unmistakable. Elizabeth could no longer stay. She had outworn their hospitality. When her refuge in San Diego closed its doors to her, Betty seems to have made the final decision to leave not just San Diego, but California. The opportunity to get to Chicago would start with Red Manley, and with a little luck, eventually transport her to Chicago, where she hoped a successful career as a model awaited her. She packed her luggage in hat boxes, cosmetics, and purse, and prepared to leave the French home. But before she departed, she gave Elvira French, her host, a parting gift, one of her hats, which she had received as payment for a modeling gig some weeks back. What was Elizabeth thinking as she packed to leave their home? Relief, perhaps. Shame, likely. Restlessness, certainly. She was no longer pretending she could be the kind of woman who belonged in the home of a stable family. San Diego had shown her that, and it may have terrified her more than any threat outside. To remain would mean facing her own inability to sustain that life. To leave meant stepping back into the only world she knew how to navigate, a world of neon lights, strangers, men, and danger. That is why she would have taken a ride with practically anyone who offered it. When Red Manley appeared, she didn't need to ask too many questions. She didn't need to weigh the risks. The lure of that bus from Los Angeles to Chicago, where a new identity awaited, was stronger than anything else. San Diego is often remembered in Elizabeth Short's story as a footnote, a brief stopover between Los Angeles and her death. But if we pause here and really look at those weeks, San Diego reveals something crucial about her. It was not just a city she drifted through. It was the stage where she tried on yet another role, a role that may have frightened her more than any before, the role of domestic belonging. The French family offered her something she rarely had: stability. Dorothy French's act of kindness, inviting Elizabeth home after finding her asleep in the Aztec Theater, was the kind of spontaneous gesture that could alter the course of a life. For nearly a month, Elizabeth stayed in their modest house, surrounded by a family structure that was warm, ordinary, and safe. Here she had a place to lay her head at night. She had meals. She had the presence of other people, a rhythm to the days. But what did Elizabeth do with that gift? At first she played the part. She was shy, polite, grateful. She cleaned as though to earn her keep. She accepted their hospitality as though she knew it was a delicate thing, something she could not strain too much. The French family later remembered her as quiet, almost withdrawn, not the glamorous figure she played elsewhere in Los Angeles. And yet, even here, within the shelter of strangers' generosity, the edges of her anxiety showed. She took advantage of her host's generosity. She accepted mysterious phone calls. She told Dorothy she was being followed by a jealous man. She seemed nervous when the doorbell rang. This is the paradox of Elizabeth Short in San Diego. In the safest place she'd been in months, she was the most afraid. Why? Was it because real danger awaited her already, or simply because stability was foreign to her? All her life, she had learned to survive in motion. From Boston to Florida, from Vallejo to Long Beach, from cheap hotels to borrowed couches. Her pattern was simple. She never stayed too long in one place. San Diego interrupted that pattern. For nearly 4 weeks, she lived in a normal family home. And with every passing day, the walls must have felt closer, the expectations sharper. She was, after all, a guest, not family, not paying rent, not someone they had chosen to keep for good, and she knew it. When Lieutenant Fickling sent her $100, she gave it to the Frenches, a gesture of gratitude, but also a reminder that she had no means of her own. It was a temporary peace, and she must have sensed how tenuous it was. Psychologically, this may have been one of the most destabilizing experiences of her life. To live inside stability and know you cannot hold it. To taste safety and know it will be taken away. That is a kind of torment Elizabeth was perhaps least equipped to face. In Los Angeles, the dangers were visible. Men who wanted something, hotel clerks who wanted payment, other women who wanted her gone. In San Diego, the danger was subtler. The creeping recognition that she could not belong, that her very presence was borrowed time. And so she began to fracture again. She slipped out at night. She met men who could offer her meals or a few dollars. She accepted calls she would not explain. She leaned back into the only survival mechanism she trusted, the performance of herself as a woman in need, a woman who could be rescued for a night or a week, if not forever. The Frenches noticed. The unease grew. By the time they asked her to leave, the experiment of domestic safety had already failed. San Diego teaches us that Elizabeth Short was not just restless. She was haunted by her own sense of displacement, by the awareness that she could never quite fit into the roles other women seemed to occupy with ease. She was not the dutiful daughter who stayed at home, nor the steady wife who managed a household, nor the ambitious actress storming auditions. She was always between identities, crafting herself from scraps of truth and invention. And in San Diego, when stability pressed too close, she unraveled into that familiar pattern once more. So when she left with Manley, it wasn't only because the Frenches asked her to go. It was because San Diego itself had revealed something unbearable, the possibility of a normal life and her inability to live it. Something new awaited, but it meant returning to Los Angeles, the city that had nearly broke her, at least for one night. In our next episode, we return to the city of broken dreams and for the last days of Elizabeth Short. Thank you for listening to The Eternal Life of the Black Dahlia. Every time we speak her real name, we return a fragment of humanity to a woman the world remembers only for the way she was murdered. This is H. Allegra Lansing. Until next time, may we remember Elizabeth Short not for how she was found, but for how she lived and how deeply she longed to be seen. This series is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and narration by yours truly. Theme music is Black Screen by Ketsa. Link in show notes.